right. Thank you so much for being here. Good morning. It's wonderful to see you all again. And I'm excited this is a talk I have never given before. I wrote it for this conference, using it as an excuse to try to work through in my own mind a question I've been wrestling with for a while. So I hope you don't mind that I'm sort of experimenting on you a little bit this morning. Oops, got to get my little clicky thing here. The church's understanding of men and women is built upon a foundational twofold principle. The sexes are characterized by both equal dignity and meaningful difference. Here's how the Catechism describes this. Man and woman have been created, which is to say, willed by God, on the one hand, in perfect equality as human persons, on the other, in their respective beings as man and woman. The Catechism is clear that, quote, man and woman are both one and the same dignity in the image of God. They are equal as persons and complementary as masculine and feminine. So this language of complement or complementarity has come to serve as a helpful shorthand for the church's understanding. It's a word that seeks to capture both strands of that twofold principle, equality and difference. Yet there are different interpretations of what complementarity actually means, both within the Catholic context, but also across the various forms of Protestantism. I was raised in evangelical Christianity, and in that landscape, there are two primary theories of God's vision for the sexes: egalitarianism on the one hand, and then complementarianism on the other. So, to put it simply, egalitarianism emphasizes the equal dignity of the sexes while minimizing our differences in order to argue against sex based roles in church leadership and the home. Complementarianism, while affirming, at least in principle, that men and women are equally in God's image, amplifies and translates the meaningful difference into distinct roles for men and women, and affirms a general hierarchy of men above women, especially in terms of leadership and authority. While this particular taxonomy of egalitarianism versus complementarianism emerged in the 80s and 90s in evangelical debates about the sexes, these basic attitudes are nothing new. In fact, they're ancient. We can trace their prototypes back to Plato and Aristotle. In her panoptic work, The Concept of Woman, Catholic philosopher Sister Prudence Allen offers a sweeping analysis of the various theories or philosophies of the sexes that have developed over centuries of Western thought. And she categorizes all of these different theories into the following framework. So there are three basic theories that emerge: sex unity theory, which affirms equal dignity, but then minimizes or denies significant differentiation. There's sex polarity, which amplifies and emphasizes differentiation in a way that kind of undermines a sense of equal dignity. Then there's a complementarity view, which tries to hold on to both. Okay. So that's her basic schema up here. So what differentiates these theories is how they hold onto or depart from that twofold principle of equality and difference. So the unity theories, we kind of trace back as far as Plato, right? Polarity theories are seen in many ancient traditions, including Aristotelian philosophy that's come up in other talks, and they emphasize difference at the expense of equality, affirming a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority between the sexes. So according to my interpretation of Allen's analysis, complementarity is a unique product of the Christian tradition, because the Christian tradition affirms, on the one hand, the shared imago Dei, the image of God, and the equal salvation of both men and women. But on the other hand, Christianity also affirms the dignity and redemption of the body. That latter emphasis on the body pushes back against a Neoplatonic unisex vision in which the body and its sexual difference is an imperfection that must be shed. And the former, the emphasis on being made in the image of God, pushes back against an Aristotelian polarity, which, while offering a vision of body-soul union, does posit femaleness as an imperfection. Christian revelation, rightly understood, corrects both of these errors, preserving that twofold principle. But it's taken centuries, right, as Angela pointed out in her talk, for that doctrine of complementarity to develop and for those errors of unity and polarity to be ultimately excluded from orthodoxy, even if they're still very much around in modern forms. Sorry, my nose is running. I like being a woman, but in times like this, I wish I was a 60-year-old British man who would just like whip out a hanky and like blow my nose. Anyway, sorry. Okay. I kind of just like melt when I give a talk. I just like start to turn into liquid. Okay. So, as Catholics, we want to endorse the theory of complementarity. But as you'll notice in Ellen's chart, there are different understandings of what complementarity entails. And she highlights two distinct variations in particular, what she terms fractional and integral, words that rely on a mathematical analogy. So, fractions, of course, represent parts of a whole, whereas an integer is another term for a whole number. Fractional complementarity then sees the sexes as complementing one another because they each reflect partial or fractional aspects of the whole human being. So, fractional complementarity can tend to divvy up various traits and virtues into pink and blue lists. Men are more rational, let's say, and women are more emotional. So, together, with our powers combined, we make up for one another's deficiencies, right? Kind of become a well-rounded human being together. Integral complementarity, in contrast, views men and women as whole persons in their own right. So the full range of human personality traits and virtues is open to cultivation by both sexes. Our complementarity then is synergistic. It does not complete a lack, but enhances a whole, resulting in a fruitful collaboration that is more than the sum of its parts. The language of the Catechism clearly endorses an integral rather than fractional complementarity. Here's another quote from the Catechism. Man and woman were made for each other. Not that God left them half-made and incomplete, right? That's kind of bing, like ding right against complementarity or fractional complementarity. He created them to be a communion of persons, in which each can be a helpmate to the other, for they are equal as persons and complementary as masculine and feminine. So men and women are not half-made and incomplete as persons. Sexual difference is not ultimately about completion, but about communion. Communion that is only possible between two whole human persons who are equal in dignity, but yet meaningful different. But what does meaningfully different actually mean? Now that I've established some guiding principles and categories, this is the question I would like to pursue in this talk. At what point does complementarity become fractional? To put it another way, how can we articulate meaningful difference without lapsing into a fractional mode, without reducing our respective geniuses into kind of pink and blue caricature? At this point, I should probably be a little honest about something. I have a particular aversion to fractional complementarity. And in part, this probably arises from my weird background, um, which is like evangelical turned feminist turned Catholic. It's been quite a journey. Um, One of the flaws of fractional complementarity is that it tends toward a hierarchical view of the sexes. It tends, or it kind of masks, a hidden polarity. The complementarianism of my evangelical upbringing definitely falls into that mode. In fact, I'll be calling this more, I'm kind of calling it fractionalism rather than fractional complementarity because I don't actually think it's a true complementarity. So, in that context, difference was translated into a generalized hierarchy between the sexes, not just in marriage, but in general, where positions of authority and leadership in all or most spheres, including teaching positions, were reserved for men. Certain virtues like obedience and humility were coded as feminine and framed in relation to men, rather primarily in relation to men, rather than in relation to God. For this reason, I am wary, and maybe overly so, whenever something belonging to the sphere of human nature is kind of bifurcated into a male or female attribute. But I also have this extensive background in feminist theory, which rather than leaning in a polarity direction, leans overwhelmingly in a unisex direction. downplaying differences in order to emphasize equality. We talked about this yesterday on the panel, how equality had become kind of conflated with sameness. Attempting to endorse or articulate meaningful difference between the sexes without heavily caveating these as patriarchal social constructs is a major faux pas in academic feminism. Difference, when acknowledged, is assumed to be both artificial, it's a construct of culture, and oppressive, something that's at odds with equality. But even in my feminist heyday, I gravitated toward French feminist theory, which, in contrast to Anglo-American feminism, holds more space for sexual difference and the importance of female embodiment. So even before I became a Catholic, I was intuitively grasping toward the Catholic position of dignity and difference. But this experience with both polarity and unisex theories often puts me in an awkward tension. I want to better understand and articulate the meaning of sexual difference, but I'm simultaneously wary of accounts of sexual difference that rely heavily on stereotypes. And that is a charge often levied against Catholic position, that it endorses restrictive stereotypes about men and women. So I want to kind of face this claim head on in this talk and be honest about my bias against stereotypes, perhaps, while also interrogating and testing this wariness to see whether it holds up to scrutiny. There are some Catholic accounts of complementarity that I do find overly fractional. These accounts tend to ground complementarity in what I will call second-order sex differences. First-order sex differences are differences that are truly binary and true of all men and women. Men have bodies that are organized, structured, according to the potential to produce small gametes and generate through insemination. Women have bodies organized according to the potential of ovulation and gestation. Here, our differences are stark. Another example of a first-order sex difference might be natural hormonal production. While females do produce some testosterone naturally, the female range does not overlap with the male range at all. Here again is a stark bifurcated difference. So first-order differences arise from sexual dimorphism, where sexual dimorphism is sharp and distinct. That's kind of what I mean by first-order differences. Second-order differences then are fuzzier. Here I'm using this term to refer to psychological or personality-based differences. Differences that are informed by biology, of course, but not strictly reducible to biology. So unlike first-order differences, oh geez, okay, thank you. These differences do exhibit a fair amount of overlap between men and women. Perhaps the simplest way to explain this distinction is this. Second-order differences fall along a spectrum with a good deal of overlap, while first-order differences do not. And I want to have a shout out to Josiah, who's a grad student here. I'm going to totally embarrass you, and I'm inspired by his work in making this distinction. He's developed a kind of schema of actually 5 orders of sex differences I think is very helpful. So I'm kind of stealing from him a little bit, but giving him credit. So some Catholic accounts of complementarity rely heavily on second-order differences, presenting psychological differences as starkly bifurcated, in order to make the claim that our ability to complement one another is based on binary differences at the level of personality. Men bring one set of traits to the table, and women bring another distinct set of traits to the table. And thus we make up for one another's deficiencies. Taken together, we are more complete, right? That's kind of the idea. One example of this approach can be found in an essay entitled Men and Women, Their Differences and Their Complementarity by Dr. Paul Vitz. He states from the outset in this essay a particular understanding of complementarity, and he proposes that, quote, many of the weaknesses of each sex are matched by the complementary strength of the other sex. He then proceeds to survey a number of biological, psychological, and neurological sex differences, which is really interesting. It's a very interesting article. But nowhere does he actually state how pronounced the differences are. So you don't get a clear sense of like what actually is the overlap in some of these differences. So the reader is left with a general impression that these differences are polarized and stark, especially as the article culminates in a chart, like a literal chart, with separate lists of masculine and feminine psychological strengths and weaknesses. And this list includes some of the traits that I'll be discussing in a moment, such as risk taking and empathy, listing the former as masculine and the latter as feminine. He then concludes his analysis of all this research with the following statement: a complementary model allows a fuller understanding of how, taken together, men and women in their strengths demonstrate a more complete image of God than does the either sex alone. So to me, that reads as kind of textbook fractional complementarity. And while Fitz is clearly using Allen's work, he uses Allen's language of synergy in describing his theory of complementarity. I would say that his overall interpretation and presentation of the data places him in a fractional rather than integral mode. When we actually look at the strength and size of these second order differences, a more complex picture emerges, one that belies a vision of complementarity wherein men and women are distinct halves that make up a whole. And I'm really not trying to pick on Dr. Witz here. I appreciate his work in this area. And the research that he assembled is really interesting in this article. But I'm kind of pointing to a disagreement with his interpretation of the data that he presents. And I'm pointing out this essay as an example of a certain interpretation of complementarity that I think is very much kind of in the air in Christian circles, that in my opinion overemphasizes second order differences. So I'd like to scrutinize this approach to complementarity, first by looking at personality differences between the sexes in order to understand where we find meaningful differences, and perhaps more importantly, how pronounced those differences actually are. So the data I'm going to present in the next section comes from a series of 15 studies based on a data set of 15,000 men and women from the US, who each completed self-assessments on various personality traits. The researchers examined over 600 traits, but they only found statistically significant differences between men and women in 18 of those traits. Surprising, right? Examples of traits from the no difference list, where there wasn't a sense of statistical difference, include things like adaptability, humor, dutifulness, self-discipline, right? So there were no clear correlation to sex in those traits. The 18 traits that did reflect a statistically meaningful difference between the sexes are listed here. Improvisational, unusual, which I think just means like you're a total weirdo. Complexity seeking, amicable, honest, warm, forgiving, aesthetic, so kind of oriented toward aesthetic, toward beauty, emotionally aware, peaceful, compassionate, unselfish, sex focused, thick skinned, risk taking, self valuing, so kind of a higher estimation of self worth, at ease, self defending. So in each of these, there was a statistically meaningful correlation to sex among these traits. However, even among these traits that did reflect a statistically significant difference, none of those differences are large differences. In fact, in the whole series of studies, there were no large differences in the average scores between men and women. So large here refers to a correlation strength of greater than 0.5. When we zero in on the one trait, which among all 600 reflects the strongest correlation to sex, even in this most pronounced difference, women are closer to the male average 37% of the time, and men are closer to the female average 28% of the time. There's a significant overlap. And again, this was the trait that was the most predictive of gender, with the strongest correlation, but we still have a sizable minority of men and women that are closer to the average of the opposite sex. So anyone want to take a guess which trait that was? Well done. All right, so here is a graph that shows the correlations of all of those sex correlated traits. And it shows the strength of the correlation, which I think is the really important missing piece that often happens in these conversations. So 9 of the traits were more um, correlated with femaleness, 9 more correlated with maleness. And so you can see that large would be above 0.5, and there are none that reach that much. There's only 2 that get into kind of a medium difference, and then everything else would be categorized as small differences. So let's take a closer look at a handful of these traits. Ones that I would say are more often featured in discussions of complementarity. So risk taking and complexity seeking on the male side, and emotional awareness and compassion on the female side. Okay, so this is risk taking. Also, you can see my scores here because you can complete the self assessment. So I'm not much fun, as you can see. um, so what's interesting here is that you can see that the clearest divergence is on the extreme end, right? Where the averages, the kind of typical male and female, are actually not that far apart. So there's significant amount of overlap here, right? And that it's actually pretty rare for either sex to be super risk-taking, okay? So to kind of say that the typical male is more of a risk taker than typical female. I mean, there's a sense in which that's true, but there's also a sense in which that exaggerates what's true. So this is less emotionally aware, more emotionally aware. Again, a lot of overlap. But also, the clearest sense of divergence is on the extreme, right? So if you're talking about a super emotionally aware person, there's a really good chance that person is female. But the average male and female are actually pretty close together. Complexity seeking. So here, for example, my score is closer to the male average than the female average. And this one has like so much overlap, right? And not a huge divergence at either end. And again, the averages are pretty close together. And here is compassionate, right? Where again, the biggest divergence is in the extreme, right? But then otherwise, it's pretty closely correlated, even though there is a meaningful statistical difference. So there are a number of key takeaways from this data that I think relate to the topic at hand. One, there are a number of statistically significant differences in personality traits between the sexes. So this pushes back against the idea that men and women are basically interchangeable. So pushes back against unisex theory. However, the differences are small for the most part, and none of them reflect a stark binary. None. Not even sex focused. I didn't show you that chart because I don't want you to see my score. This pushes back against some of the interpretations of complementarity that present small differences as if they are large differences or even binary differences, as if our personalities are as asymmetrical as our bodies. So it pushes back against polarity theory. Almost any person will have a mix of results, if they take the self-assessment, between male-leaning or female-leaning personality traits. Like in the charts I just showed you, my score, I think, was closer to the female average on 2, closer to the male average on 2. And if you do the self-assessment, it predicts your gender based on your answers. And so this model predicted that I would have a 75% chance of being female, 25% chance of being male, just by my answers, right? So we could tell by my answers, right, that it was kind of pointing in that direction. On the whole, I was closer to the female averages. But there were a number of specific traits where I scored closer to the male range. In addition, and this is, I think, is really important, the differences become more pronounced and bifurcated in the extreme ends of the spectrum, not among men and women in the average. And I think this is important because in some discussions of complementarity, the extremes are presented as what is typical of males or typical of females. Whereas in reality, the typical males and females are the ones closer to the averages of both sexes. And this is one of my worries about some articulations of complementarity. Small differences are presented as large or stark differences, and thus what is actually atypical for a male or female is presented as representative in general. We have kind of an exaggerated representation of a trait difference. The female who's closer to the male average and vice versa is often presented as the outlier, the exception, when in fact she's often closer to the norm. So, what then are the implications of all this when it comes to thinking about complementarity, particularly that distinction between fractional and integral complementarity? So, to be clear, simply acknowledging, discussing, or studying the differences between the sexes does not result in fractional complementarity. We don't need to be afraid to discuss these kinds of differences. I find it very interesting. However, I believe we do veer into fractionalism when a trait that is essentially human is presented as belonging overwhelmingly or even exclusively to one sex or the other. One of the hallmarks of integral complementarity is the claim that our differences, while meaningful and significant, in no way preclude each sex's ability to develop as a full human being. To put another way, fractional complementarity arises when second-order differences are assumed to be just as binary and static as first-order differences. That's the first step toward fractionalism. And so this leads me to the claim that I'm testing out in this talk. While second-order differences, such as the ones I've been discussing, they do play a part in complementarity, like they're not insignificant, but they show up, they're meaningful at the aggregate level, right? They're meaningful maybe at the population level, at the group level, but they're not always or even typically at play at the level of individual men and women. Ergo, I think, these differences cannot be the ground of complementarity. It cannot be the ground of our respective geniuses, because then a great number of men and women would be exempt from that genius. While analysis and discussion of second-order differences is important and fruitful, our understanding of complementarity should be primarily grounded in first-order difference. Grounded, in other words, in our asymmetrical embodiment. I'm going to call John Paul II JP2 here because I really like calling him that, even though I know he's Pope Great St. John Paul the whatever. Hey, just, it's easier. JP2's writings provide an excellent resource here for thinking about complementarity first and foremost in terms of embodiment. In his Theology of the Body, when he uses the terms masculinity and femininity, he does not apply these to traits that are abstracted away from embodiment. Rather, those terms refer back to the body, to our distinct ways of embodying human nature. So here's how he describes this. Masculinity and femininity are two different incarnations. That is, two ways in which the human being, created in the image of God, is a body. Man and woman constitute, so to speak, two diverse ways of being a body that are proper to human nature. Implicit in his words are the two fundamental principles of integral complementarity: equal dignity, as both men and women are fully human and made in God's image, as well as meaningful difference, which is manifest primarily in our sexed bodies. It is the embodied person, then, who inflects a trait or an action with masculinity or femininity. It is not the trait per se that is masculine or feminine. Our meaningful difference is not rooted in having differing sets of personality traits. Our difference shows up in how these traits are embodied and enacted in the world. A man exhibiting compassion is not reducible to a woman exhibiting compassion. Not because the trait per se is different, but because that trait is being embodied by a male and thus takes on a paternal rather than maternal character. Picture an icon of Joseph holding the Christ child. I'll help you out. Isn't it a good one? Now picture an icon of Mary holding the Christ child. If we were to describe these two images in terms of abstractions, we would likely have a lot of overlap: tenderness, love, protection. But these images are not interchangeable. They are meaningfully different. They are irreducible to one another. But the difference arises from the sexed embodiment. In his letter to women, JP2 refers to this as, quote, iconic complementarity. Our bodies carry an iconic meaning. We are icons. We carry a powerfully evocative symbolism that reflects some of the most sacred metaphors in the Christian tradition. A man can reflect, in a distant but important way, the iconic character of God as Father and Christ as Bridegroom, just as a mother can reflect the icon of the Theotokos, the God-bearer, and the Church as bride. When John Paul II draws out the significance of our meaningful difference in his theology of the body, he emphasizes the sacramental meaning of sexual difference, maleness and femaleness as visible signs of invisible realities. Our distinct bodies carry a nuptial and generative meaning that proclaims the human power to express love and form a life-giving communion of persons. In this way, he writes, man and woman become, quote, the image of an inscrutable divine communion of persons. Through our sexual difference, in a distant but profound way, we image the Trinity. Maleness points beyond itself toward femaleness and vice versa. Our bodies signal that we are not self-enclosed, self-generating, autonomous monads. We are made for one another. As JP2 describes, the body, which expresses femininity for masculinity, and vice versa, masculinity for femininity, manifests the reciprocity and the communion of persons. Our sexual difference, then, is a sign of this reciprocal for, a sign that we are made for communion and self-giving love, whether that is lived out within marriage or within a celibate vocation. This dynamic of self-gift and reciprocity between the sexes is sometimes characterized, never by JP2, in a fractional way. It usually goes something like this: the man is the giver, the woman is the receiver. Now, there's some truth to this, but it's only a partial truth. If we reflect on the body, it is true that in the process of generation, the man gives of his own life-giving potential, which the woman then receives within herself in order to make it fruitful. But in bearing fruit, the woman then becomes the giver. The man must receive his child from the woman. He cannot generate within himself. He gives and receives. She receives and gives. The dynamic of gift and reciprocity then is mutual and reciprocal. And this dynamic is also evident in John Paul II's interpretation of the Genesis creation account, the second account. In fact, in his reading, he places man primarily and first in the receptive mode. It is God who initiates the dynamic of gift. And it is man who receives the gift of the woman from God. And he also receives her gift of self, and then he gives himself in response. It is this reciprocal dynamic of giving and receiving that creates the communion of persons. On the whole, John Paul II's account of sexual difference and complementarity emphasizes mutuality, reciprocity, and self-gift. He's actually very restrained when it comes to making sharp distinctions between men and women in terms of traits or roles, beyond those that lie in first-order sexual differences, beyond those that are linked to motherhood and fatherhood. But there is one key area where he does highlight a specific call or task that God has placed on the man, and it is in the context of this dynamic of gift. Due to the effects of sin and concupiscence, the original dynamic between the sexes, that reciprocal self-gift, has become distorted or disrupted. JP2 writes, the relationship of the gift changes into a relationship of appropriation. According to JP2, the man, as the first to receive God's gift of the woman, quote, ought to have been, from the beginning, the guardian of the reciprocity of the gift and its true balance. The man has a special responsibility to welcome femininity as a gift, not as something to appropriate or own or possess, and to initiate and preserve that mutual, two-sided, reciprocal exchange between persons. This means actively resisting the effects of concupiscence, the temptation to treat woman as an object of appropriation rather than a gift. He writes, "It is in open conflict with this exchange, the gift, to take from the woman her own gift by concupiscence. Although maintaining the balance of the gift seems to be something entrusted to both, right? So we are both bear responsibility in this. However, the man has a special responsibility, as if it depended more on him whether the balance is kept or violated, or even, if it has already been violated, reestablished." A specific task or role that JP2 does specifically entrust to men is to be guardians of the freedom of the gift. Men are called to steward their strength and power into an interior battle against evil, against the effects of sin, which distort love into domination. This entails cultivating their own internal freedom in order to ensure the freedom of the woman from appropriation and domination. It's only in a context of freedom that one can have a gift of self, right? The gift of self can never be compelled or coerced. It requires freedom. And so the man is sort of the guardian of that freedom. There's also a specific task or mission entrusted to women that comes through in JP2's writings. A prophetic call that is connected to our bodies and their maternal potential. That's my phrasing to use, maternal potential. Now, by the phrase maternal potential, I want to be very clear. I'm not restricting this to only mothers. After all, to experience the unique pain of a miscarriage or the unique pain of the inability to conceive a child within one's womb, only a person whose body carries maternal potential can experience those things. Those are uniquely maternal experiences. An infertile woman then still has a maternal body. An unmarried woman still has a maternal body. A consecrated virgin still has a maternal body. Whether or not we ever become mothers in the literal biological sense, our bodies are structured according to a potential to generate a new human life within, to house, protect, and foster a new human life in its most hidden and vulnerable stages. John Paul II calls women sentinels of the invisible. I love that phrase. We are the primary guardians, not the exclusive guardians. It's not like only our job, but we are the primary guardians of the dignity of human life, especially persons who are hidden, who are overlooked or discarded, unseen. If the man has a primary role in preserving and safeguarding the dynamic of mutual self-gift and love between the sexes, in receiving the woman as gift, the woman has a primary role in safeguarding the gift of the child and protecting this dynamic of love from the threat of domination. It is telling, I think, that the most damaging scandals of our time reflect violent betrayals of both of these calls. The sex scandals within the church reveal a perverse and total betrayal of the masculine mission to resist the temptation of dehumanizing sexual conquest. And the culture-wide celebration of abortion, under the guise of protecting women's rights and dignity, is a betrayal of the feminine mission to safeguard the sanctity of hidden human life. This understanding of complementarity, of our respective missions in the world, based on the prophetic call of our embodiment, truly reflects an integral vision, a vision of men and women as whole persons, which includes the freedom to respond to this call. Our meaningful difference is not rooted primarily in abstracted, polarized traits, but in the genius of our bodies, the genius of our nature, which presents to us a mission and a task, one that we can choose to accept or reject. Fractionalism tends to view differences as static or fixed, as if we are pre-programmed to think and feel and act in these two polarized modes. But any truly Catholic theory of complementarity must include an emphasis on human freedom and our moral agency. Even if we are responsive to and influenced by biological and social forces, we are not wholly determined by them. We are not machines. We are animals, yes, but moral and rational animals, capable of self-shaping choices and acts, particularly in cooperation with divine grace. Authentic masculinity, then, is not about exhibiting male typical personality traits or embodying a stereotype. It is living and embodying holiness as a man. Authentic femininity is not about ticking off boxes on the pink trait list. True femininity is to manifest holiness as a female human being. It is holiness that makes our sexual difference truly iconic, enabling our visible bodies to proclaim what is invisible, to reveal the glory of God, which is the man and the woman who is fully alive. Thank you.